Thank you, Kim and Ian. So, if culture is the answer, what is the question? 3 questions were asked from the Royal Australian Navy. How can Navy leaders collectively lead and inspire 14,000 people to better meet current and future challenges? Sanitarium asked the question, how do we encourage risk in an organisation that has previously rewarded stability? And now with Grant Thornton, how do we unlock our potential for growth? So my job this morning is to answer the question as to why is culture the answer. Much of what I will refer to throughout this session, this final session, is in that book, so I urge you to have a look at that after the event. So let's be clear what we mean by organisational culture. This is the textbook definition, the shared values, norms and expectations that govern the way people approach their work and interact with each other. The very key words in there, culture is about behavioural norms. So every societal group, your family, your household, your tennis team, your golf club, whatever it might be, they have norms, they have rules, they have written rules, they have unwritten rules. In terms of norms, most of them are unwritten, but they're what is expected of you, what you're supposed to do in a given situation. What we're interested in at the organisational level is how it impacts on the way in which you approach your work and how we interact with each other. So just to be clear about what we mean by that, this is what we mean by approach your work. So it's around how you solve problems, how you make decisions, how you respond to deadlines. This is what we mean by interact with each other, how we work in teams, how we work across teams, how we respond to authority, etc. Okay? Now I'm going to show you a very short video clip to illustrate just how culture works. Unlike the videos that you've seen to date, the quality is absolutely and utterly appalling. So I'm not showing it to you for the quality of the video, but the quality of the content. If you're prepared to admit it and you're old enough to remember, you may recall a TV program called Candid Camera, Alan Funk. So this is a late 50s, early 60s Candid Camera clip, but it's an excellent illustration of how organisational culture works.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door. Everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
So it's not for naught that culture has been humorously referred to as a game of follow the leader. So culture is how people believe they are expected to behave in order to fit in. Everybody's facing this way, I should turn around and face that way. And so it's about what we believe we need to do in order to fit in, get ahead, and in some organisational culture simply survive. It's not another word for climate. or employee engagement. It is in fact at the very, very core of how an organisation functions. Because of this, factors like teamwork, engagement, innovation, etc. are outcomes of organisational culture. So a little bit of data. So there's one section of the book that's dedicated to the relationship between the behavioural variables being measured and outcomes that are being measured. So what we're looking at here, and it's very important to understand this, is the relationship between cause and effect. So what is the relationship between the constructive styles and various outcomes and the defensive styles and various outcomes? So what we've taken here is a group of about 900 organisations from Australia and New Zealand. So they're randomly selected from that 2,500 data set. And we've taken the 10% most constructive and the 10% least constructive. So that's the left and right profiles. In the middle are the outcomes associated with those two groups. And so at this level, it's the individual level outcomes. And so it's things like satisfaction, motivation, role clarity, and stress. And you can see the difference between the more constructive organisation cultures and the more defensive organisation cultures. So if you're interested in something like employee engagement at the moment, for instance, or satisfaction or motivation or role clarity, they are outcomes of culture, and you can see the impact in that data that a constructive culture has on those outcomes. At the group level, we measure three outcomes, teamwork, inter-unit coordination, and what we call departmental level quality. One of the best measures of quality, strangely enough, in terms of quality of service, is actually asking the people inside the organisation, because one of the truisms is the customer only knows whether he or she is getting what he or she expects, whereas your staff actually know what you're capable of doing. So can you go further than what you are currently doing? So again, it's the same groups, the top and bottom 10%. You can see the differences are quite marked. And then we go to the two organisational level outcomes. So how the quality of the organisation in terms of the service it provides its customers, and how adaptable is the organisation to changes in its external environment. So again, same top and bottom 10%. You can see the differences are quite dramatic. So shifting, that's why in the awards, where an organisation has shifted from a predominantly defensive culture to a predominantly constructive culture, one of the things that we know will, in all probability, improve as a consequence of that is the customer service and the quality of service that goes with that, and the ability of the organisation to adapt, which has implications for the ability of the organisation to innovate and all the things that you heard, for instance, Todd Saunders talk about under Sanitarium. So here's the question to be asked: why is culture the answer? And it really just simply goes something like this. Treat this as a conceptual organisation chart. Don't worry about the detail on it. Right? So what's happening if you're a senior executive in a largest organisation with a tree that looks vaguely something like that? There are a number of relationships that exist within that organisation. So the first type of relationship is the very obvious one, the leadership relationship. So you have the MD with his or her executive team, you have the marketing manager with his or her business unit teams, and so on and so forth, right down to the team leader with his or her team members. You also have a second type of relationship, the so-called strategic team relationship. And there's a third kind of relationship, which is at the tactical level. And then there's a fourth kind of relationship, which is cross-functional. That looks very messy. It's designed to look messy because that's how organisations function. Organisations are, in fact, an unorganised combination of relationships. So right now, in your organisation, without you being there, all those relationships are carrying on, but nobody's actually orchestrating the whole thing. It's being orchestrated at the micro level. And so relationships are not just about how people get on. That's the easy, soft side. It's about how people arrive at the decisions that they make. That's the important thing about relationships and organisation. So what characterises a good working relationship? Firstly, something like trust. Secondly, respect. Thirdly, willingness to voice and accept differences in a constructive way. So if I disagree with you, I will disagree with you, but I'll do so constructively. Commitment to a common goal, willingness to be accountable, clarity of roles, objectives and expectations, and last and not least, lack of ego. Okay? Those are the 7 things that are required for relationships between teams, the organisation to work effectively. So it's the organisation's culture that influences how those relationships work. either to the organisation's advantage or disadvantage. And there's a great quote from Shaun, one of the most prolific writers on organisational culture, where he says, if you do not manage culture, it manages you, and you may not even be aware to the extent to which this is happening. Right? So culture is always happening. As you saw in the drama, this is culture. This is culture being played out here in the way in which that group is striving to arrive at a decision. So what happens when the relationships aren't great? Right? So if you don't have trust, what you'll have is something along the lines, obviously distrust, but what does that mean? It means lack of confidence in each other. So when it comes to make a decision with you, if I lack confidence in you, then that's going to affect the way in which I don't listen to you, etc. Respect, obviously disrespect, but what does that mean? It means lack of commitment to the decision. If you don't have willingness to voice and accept constructive differing, then you'll have superficial relationships where I'm trying to be very nice to you, and as a consequence, an adequate exploration of the data, so consequently poor decisions. If you don't have commitment to a common goal, you've got self-interest and competing priorities. If you don't have willingness to be accountable, you have low standards and avoidance of responsibility. If you don't have clarity of roles and objectives, you'll have unnecessary conflict because we just don't see things in the same way. So we're wasting time disagreeing on something because we start from a different point. And if we don't have lack of ego, then we'll have internal competition and blaming of others. And for those that know the circumplex, it's not a coincidence that I chose to colour those red and green. And essentially that's why culture is the answer. If all that dysfunctional stuff is going on in your organisation, then your people are not focusing on what is important, which is performing at a really high level and striving for excellence. One of the things to keep in mind, you've heard from three very, very different kinds of organisations. Culture is not about strategy. It is about execution. So culture is not, a technical term, strategy dependent. It doesn't matter whether you're an insurance company, a bank, a manufacturer, a FMCG, a Royal Australian Navy or whatever. It's not about your strategy, it's about your ability to achieve and execute that strategy. So let me give you again, there is a section in the book on this, some data to illustrate this. 3 profiles here. This is using the organisational culture inventory data, which is the survey tool around how do we believe we are expected to behave here. So on the left-hand side, you have the ideal. For those that are unfamiliar with this exercise, when we do a survey of an organisation, we get generally something like the executive group to complete an ideal or preferred culture survey. So what behaviours do you think should be promoted in this organisation? How should we expect people to behave in order for our organisation to best achieve its objectives? And as you can see in that left-hand profile, they've said a whole lot of constructive stuff. Then we've taken the data from this particular sector, manufacturing, and taken again the 10%, actually it's 25% because it's less organisations here, 25% most constructive cultures and 25% least constructive cultures. So here we've set up an equation. The ideal seems to be what they want. So we can isolate out the most constructive and the most offensive and compare the outcome measures. So we have outcome measures like service quality, external adaptability, role clarity, employee advocacy and satisfaction. The blue bar is the most constructive group, the middle profile, and the green-red bar is the right, the least constructive. So as you can see, in manufacturing, organisations that have more constructive cultures have significantly higher outcomes. I'm just going to flick through some other industries if you're curious about those. So there's technology, it's the same equation, I don't need to explain that again, and there's the outcomes. So in technology industry in particular, there's like a 34% difference in external adaptability through that survey process. Financial services, banks, insurance companies, ideal, most constructive, least constructive, the differences in outcomes between the most and least in that industry. Local government, very similar picture again, and again, very similar picture in the outcomes. So culture is not about what your strategy is, it's about how capable you are of achieving your strategy. So the role leadership plays in influencing culture, because that's what you've listened to this morning, particularly with the Royal Australian Navy. The focus is on changing the Navy one leader at a time. And so we need to look at the role that leadership plays in influencing culture. Leaders influence culture in 2 ways. One is what's called the direct impact, and so this is through my personal style, if you like, how I think, how I behave. Do I behave? So you saw the LSI profiles that we used with Roz in the Navy presentation. So do I behave as your manager, leader, constructively, passively, aggressively, or whatever it might be? What we call leadership strategies and management approaches, which is how I go about leading, how do I manage influence, how do I set goals with you and all that kind of stuff. That's what we're most familiar with. That's what the whole 360 feedback industry is built around, is giving managers and leaders feedback on their thinking, behaviour, approach to leadership and approach to management. But equally as important is the leaders and managers' indirect impact on culture. So this is through things like the vision, mission and values. So you heard examples of signature behaviours, which is a way of emphasising the vision, mission, values kind of stuff. It's how we design the structure. So the decisions we make about centralisation, decentralisation to do with influence, power and involvement impact on culture. The systems, the HR systems. So you heard Kim from Grant Thornton talk about changing the remuneration system for partners to better reflect collegial effort as opposed to individual effort. The job designs, how we design jobs, gives very, very important messages to people in the organisation. This can sound esoteric, it's not, it's actually very pragmatic. So if we take job design as one example, you'll all be familiar with the concept of autonomy. Right? That's an element of job design. So does the job have the ability to make decisions by the person within the job about how the job will get done, otherwise known as autonomy, right? Now, one of the lack of blessings of the proliferation of IT technology is the dumbing down of jobs. Because computers can do so much stuff for us, a lot of the baseline jobs in organisations, they don't need to think. So if we design jobs along those lines and we design jobs with low autonomy, people basically get the message from that you're not interested in the way they think, you're not interested in them using their initiative. It's basically do the job. It's very prescribed. This is what you do, clock in, do it, clock out kind of stuff. And that describes, unfortunately, far too many jobs out there. Now here's the kicker. Because what happens is you and your executive group go up, I don't know, some sort of up the Hunter Valley or somewhere like that to have a bit of an executive retreat, and you talk about vision and values and culture change and all that sort of good stuff, and you decide, let's just pretend for the sake of the story to do something around innovation. And so you come back to the organisation with all these messages about we want you to innovate, we want you to be creative, we want you to come up with ideas for improvement, and we basically want you to be innovative. Now you actually have to take that person sitting in that low autonomy job, put a voice bubble above that person's head that basically says something along the lines, you've got to be freaking kidding me. Because that's not what the job requires of me. There was no opportunity to use my initiative in this low autonomy job, and you're asking me to use my initiative, which is one of the many reasons why people like Cotter do research that suggests that 70% of change programs fail, because you've got to look at it holistically, right? Communication processes is the last of them. So how we approach our leadership responsibilities impacts how others believe they should behave, culture, and determines our effectiveness. So this is another section on the book, based on a particular feedback tool for people in very senior executive positions called Leadership Impact. This very detailed slide, so I'll just walk you through this very briefly. There are 3 layers of information here. The top layer is what you do and how you do it. In this case, what you do is influence. So leaders influence others, so it's called influencing. I can do that in one of 2 ways. I can do it in a way that is reciprocal influence, so we share the influence, or I can do it in ways that are unilateral influence. So basically I keep all the influence to myself, right? So what the top graph is measuring is how the what is done. And I can do it reciprocal and unilateral. Now, in fact, one of the things that we found in putting the research together behind this tool is that leaders do both. Leaders use reciprocal influence, but at times, as a chief executive, I have to say, no, I'm going with my gut on that one. That's my decision to make. Right? All the important questions like wine biscuits versus chocolate biscuits kind of stuff. Right? So I'll use reciprocal and unilateral. The question is, to what extent do I use each? So the left-hand bar, look at the blue. The blue is the leaders in that data set that use the most reciprocal leadership. And the blue bar on the right is how much unilateral they use. So they use a lot of reciprocal and not very much of the unilateral. The green-red bar on the right-hand side, sitting next to the most reciprocal unilateral bar, is the leaders that use the most unilateral. And then over the left-hand side is how much reciprocal do they use. Do you get that? So it's like the most reciprocal and how much unilateral, and the most unilateral and how much reciprocal. Now the difference in impact on culture between those two types of leaders are the two profiles in the middle to the left and the right. So the leaders that use the most reciprocal and not so much unilateral have a very constructive impact on others. Leaders that use the most unilateral but still do quite a bit of reciprocal have that very defensive impact, and down the bottom is the effectiveness of those people. And so the difference goes something like that. This is a very important finding to start with. The difference between the great and the not so good leaders in that data set is the great leaders do a little bit more of the positive stuff, if you like, but they do a hell of a lot less of the negative stuff. Because as you well know, any of you who are parents, you know, whenever you do something that's just a little bit negative to one of your children, you've got to do 100 good things to make up for it, especially if they're teenagers, right? Same with people that we're leading in the organisation. The difference in performance looks something like that, so it's quite dramatic. Okay? I'm just going to show you one more. It's the same formula, providing feedback. I can provide feedback in a positive way. I can focus on what you're doing well, and or I can provide feedback around negative stuff, focusing on what you're not doing well, what performance issues. Now again, as a leader, I will do both. The question is, which will I do most of, and how often will I do them? So the most positive and how much negative they use, and the most negative and how much positive they use. And again, you see quite dramatic differences on the right-hand side. A small amount more of the positive feedback, but a lot less of the negative feedback. The difference on culture and the difference in performance. It's not just the senior leaders, it's also the middle managers. Often a layer of large organisations that gets forgotten about. So how we approach our management responsibilities impacts on how others believe they should behave. So this is the same formula, it's a different tool. It's called management impact for middle managers. So it's looking at managerial responsibilities, which of course includes leadership, right? So this one, for instance, is managing goals. So the most facilitating managing goals use 15% more than the most inhibiting managing goals, but 43% less of that inhibiting stuff. So again, it's the same equation, a little bit more of the positive, but a hell of a lot less of the negative. And again, the difference in impact and the difference in performance. And for want of another example, managing teams, which is a managerial responsibility, 14% more of the positive, but 34% less of the negative, makes big difference in impact and dramatic difference in effectiveness. So it's further evidence of the efficacy and the impact of those constructive styles at the individual level. So again, you heard Ros talking about the research and the return on investment for the Navy. The leadership impact tool, by the way, was what underpinned the Grant Thornton exercise. Looking at that, how they do what they do, the impact it has on others and how effective they are. This is based on the LSI, which is probably familiar to many of you in the room. So how we think, our self-concept, influences our sense of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is very, very important. As a very famous cognitive psychologist once said to me about 30 years ago, I mean, if you don't think you're very effective at what you do, why the hell should anybody else? Think about it, right? So self-efficacy, I'm quite good at doing this, I'm not too bad at doing that, whatever it might be. So here's some data from the LSI. What we've taken here is from a very large data set of 47,000 managers, leaders in Australia and New Zealand. We've taken the most constructive and the least constructive, again, 10%. Right? And so those right-hand and left-hand profiles will remain constant throughout the LSI 1 slides. Now we're looking at how effective do you think you are in your job and how effective do you think you are in terms of building relationships with others. And look at the difference. It's enormous. Remember this, every action is preceded by a thought. So if we can look into your thinking, we're going to get some great insights into your action. So personal efficacy is firstly important and underpins those constructive styles. So again, you heard Ian talk at Grant Thornton around the challenge for him personally in his own personal story and a period of self-doubt and going through that, which is all part of the change process, but then applying that constructive thought process to overcome that challenge. Satisfaction at work. Again, it's the same left and right profiles, but now it's how satisfied are you with your current job, your work accomplishments, your organisation, and your career prospects. So again, the more constructively I think, the more satisfied I am with my job. Now, for some, this might be unimportant, but for most of us, it's extremely important. I mean, you're a hell of a long time dead. So one of the fundamental rules is you should enjoy this life. So it's called personal well-being. So we measure satisfaction with life in general in terms of ability to manage stress, leisure time, satisfaction with leisure time activities, satisfaction with family life, satisfaction with personal health, and satisfaction with general state of mind. And again, look at the differences, 20 to nearly 40%. The more constructive the thinking, the more the personal well-being is in a positive state. Again, we see that in this data, we see it in terms of people who become more constructive in their thought process and they increase their satisfaction with their leisure time. This is the interesting thing about thinking. Sometimes those people actually have less leisure time because they're working a little more or harder. But as part of that shift towards constructive thinking, they enjoy their leisure time significantly more than they did before. It's not about how much, it's about what you do with how much you've got. LSI 2, feedback from others on personal styles. So how do you see me behaving? Do you see me behaving constructively, passive defensively, or aggressive defensively? So our behaviours influence how our colleagues perceive us and how they rate our personal effectiveness. So again, we've taken a large number of LSI 2 feedback managers and leaders from Australia and New Zealand, isolated out the 10% most constructive, the 10% least constructive, so those profiles remain constant, and looked at certain outcomes. So this time it's like the self-efficacy looked at how do I think I am at task and interpersonal effectiveness. Now I get some feedback from you folks on how effective do you think I am in my job and in terms of interpersonal effectiveness. So the most constructive, 42% higher than the most defensive. So again, the more we shift towards constructive, the more effective people seem to think that we are in our jobs. So a little bit of detail, so how stressed am I and do you see me stressed? How good do you think I am at managing my time? And how satisfied do you guys think I am in my job? So stress reduction reduces by 37%, 29-24 for the other two. Again, quite dramatic differences. So the evidence is quite clear. This is something that we've been working with for 40 years. Constructive behaviours produce results at the individual, group and organisational levels. And this is why. It really is no more complicated than this. I think it was Todd said, there's no great rocket science behind this. When we put the science behind it to make the obvious clear. Constructive cultures cause people to focus on performance. Right? So it's about people thinking and using their brains and using their initiative and thinking about alternatives before they act, about looking at possibilities when it comes to decision making, being open to alternate perspectives and points of view. So we're using our brain. Passive defensive cultures cause people to focus on keeping themselves safe. Okay? So to avoid criticism, do nothing, say nothing, be nothing. So basically I would just, keep my head down, do what I'm told, keep myself out of trouble. Now, if that's my thought process, if that's how I believe I am expected to behave, to fit in, get ahead, and at times simply survive here, then it's going to be very difficult for me to suddenly use my initiative, be creative, and think of alternatives, and be open to differing perspectives from people. And the aggressive defensive styles in a culture cause people to focus on stuff that gets in the way. So it's all about finding fault, blame, competing with each other, failing to see the woods for the trees kind of thing, and focusing on the minute and the me as opposed to the broader picture and the we. And ladies and gentlemen, essentially that is why culture is the answer. Thank you very much.